Hi, everyone. Welcome to First Person Platform, the new podcast for platform engineers. And we're beginning with a short series of episodes with engineers who built or led teams who build tooling for secure workload and service access. In each episode, we'll be digging into what was the motivation behind building the system, a bit of the origin story and lessons learned. I'm a pretty new podcast host, but my guest Andrew is awesome, and we're going to have a great time. I'm Ori Shoshan, by day the co-founder / CTO of Otherwise, where we make declarative workload IAM finally easy. Joining me today is Andrew Fong, the co-founder and CEO of Prodvana, and previously VP Engineering Infrastructure at Dropbox. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Ori. Nice to meet you.
nice to meet
see you,
you
I should say.
To meet you again, yeah. So let's get started with a little warm-up question. So Andrew, what are two must-have tools to deploy on a Kubernetes cluster, and one common tool you actually prefer not to use?
I feel like this is a softball question because we do a little bit of Kubernetes management at Prodvana. So I will say one of the two must-use tools on Kubernetes is Prodvana. We actually use it to manage everything in our infrastructure end-to-end. So we definitely make very heavy use of it. I think the other is some sort of monitoring system, some sort of telemetry system, observability system. I think right now we're biased towards Datadog just because it's super simple to set up. I've used a lot of the other ones, but I think really you just need a tool to do observability. It doesn't really matter which one. Just get started with it. Common tool I prefer not to use.
I'm digging for a hot take.
Yeah, digging for let's see. Hot take for me would be, I think if you can avoid using Kubernetes for as long as possible, it's a good thing. What I mean by this is you can get, not that Kubernetes is not a good solution for a lot of people, especially enterprise, but I think if you're a two-person company, having a Kubernetes cluster that you're trying to manage, we've seen this with some people, that can be a lot of overhead. But in terms of like on cluster, I actually, to be honest, I think the pattern I bias away from is things like dealing with CRDs and doing sort of like anything internal to the cluster aside from very vanilla standard things. I find that having built large systems and manage them as simple as possible is always the best. That's probably the best. My prefer not to use question.
Stick to the bare bones. It's sort of my attitude too, and I guess it relates to what you said about if you can, don't use Kubernetes. If it's simple, because you can just do so much with so little, but you introduce a ton of complexity with every tool, right? So let's do a little introduction. So I said a little bit about what you do, but now it's your turn to say it in your words. So what do you do? Who do you work for?
Okay, so intro to Andrew. I have been doing infrastructure for probably the last 25 years now. Started at the end of the .com era at AOL, worked in web cache and proxy, and got to see some incredible scale there. After that, moved to the West Coast, where I've been about 17 years now. Was still at AOL, but transferred and worked on Winamp and Spinner, if anybody remembers those products back in the MP3 days. After that, went to YouTube, where I saw YouTube grow from about 1 billion views to 30 billion views a day. There was roughly about, I think I joined, it was about 100 people, saw it through about 3,000 people. And then Dropbox, about 100 people through 3,000 people as well, where I eventually ended up running all of infrastructure there. After Dropbox, did a startup as a CTO gig and then ended up founding Prodvana. My heart is in infrastructure. I've done it for 25 years, spent a year in fintech, and was like, I just really feel that infrastructure, it's getting super complicated, and all the things that we saw inside of Google or inside of a Dropbox, they're now becoming things that every single engineer had to learn with public cloud. And like Cloud Wave 1 was great. Now we're kind of moving to the second wave of cloud of how do we actually use it. There's this famous meme at Google, how do I serve 1 terabyte or 10 terabytes, which is
I love that video. And like the monotonic tone.
Yeah. It's like, how do I actually just serve 10 terabytes? Like, and at Google, that's very hard. And I feel like public cloud has actually made that same problem exist for everyone else now. It's easy to get, so it's just more and more complicated. That's what led us to start Prodvana, where we believe in zero overhead. Purpose is to eliminate the complexity of sort of software delivery. That's our goal. We want to make it as easy to ship things to your users as possible on the production side.
Cool.
That's
Yeah,
me.
there's a cute quote on your that was in your KubeCon booth, which got us talking, which we'll get into.
Yes.
I'm teasing the viewers. So I guess you kind of touched on that, but like, what led you to start Prodvana specifically? Like, why did you hone in on that?
Um, so my experience in infrastructure and platforms, the delivery process is the heart of engineering in so many ways. It's both business process as well as technical process, and ends up being such high leverage, but not really looked upon as like a place to go intercept at. And but what I
Mhm.
found is every time I touch something at scale, that was the first thing we fixed. YouTube, we built out I gave this presentation actually at CDCon. Jokingly said like we built GitOps at YouTube in like 2007, where we would just have a SVN repository on the edge of every server, and we ran SVN up out of cron
Wow.
on a 5 minute splay, and that's how we sync configuration out. Which is, I mean, that's all Argo effectively does at this point too.
Yeah.
It does more, right? Like in terms of like workflow management a little bit, but it's hard, right? That's what it does. And then Dropbox, and we also had a deployment system that we built from scratch because we had to run rsync and we had to do this to like tens of thousands of machines. Move on to Dropbox, same problem. We actually had a similar system there. We used Mercurial and we ran HG up on every single machine and a 5 minute splay. Same
Yeah.
exact same strategy, and we would distribute a bunch of host files to every box that had a list of all the servers, and that would tell us what to
Wow.
run on them. And like we built all this like all this mechanical stuff around it, which Kubernetes encapsulates a lot of today, but only at the infrastructure layer. And we found is that
Right.
we over time, every single one of the companies that were early cloud adopters built a system that was at a one level higher abstraction. So Netflix, you get Spinnaker. Uber has
Mhm.
udeploy. Dropbox had a system called Yaps. I off the top of my head, I think Pinterest uses a variation of the Spinnaker platform, and some homegrown, some Spinnaker. Palantir has a system called Apollo. Every single one of the company's early cloud adopters built this because none of this, they realized you had to manage dependencies, you had to manage
Yeah.
services. It's just a different problem than managing a single 10, 15 hosts. And Kubernetes is an infrastructure layer. It's not a platform built for engineers to run applications on. So we
Yeah,
said
it's
that's
exactly
that'd be
right.
easier.
It's
Um,
a bunch of the APIs are just a bit too low level,
yep,
right? So network policies, they talk the language of networks and
yep,
IP
yep.
addresses, and they try to creep a little bit into, you know, the higher level with pod selectors, but it leaves a lot to be desired, and you gotta go up one layer.
You have to go up one layer. And what we found is actually the real motivation, like true motivation, is what we saw is it's an interface interlock problem. What we're seeing is that you have always an infrastructure or platform team, and then you have this product team, and it's really they're trying to transact work between the two of them, and they're trying to determine who's responsible for what parts. And so we
Mhm.
said like really that's the essence of application platform. So deployment kind of gets at that way better than all of the new wave packaging schemas, or like let's build
Mhm.
a way to spin up services very easily. It doesn't get at the core of it, which is like the day-to-day. Once you launch a service, you have to operate this thing forever, and so that interlock is way more important to get right than the day zero, hey, I want to launch a service. It's really
Yeah.
the everything after that has to like work really well together. So we
So
said, how do we
basically,
build that interlock? Yeah, go ahead.
thinking of the entire life cycle, like, you
Yep,
know, start to end, and where the
yep,
engineers fit in and where the platform team fits
yep,
in,
yep,
and not just let's make it really easy to
yep.
serverless deploy.
Exactly. We really focused on. We realized that we would need multiple personas, for example, in the product. um,
Hmm.
we would have to like where most of these products focus on just infrastructure or just application. We said if it's an interlock product, you have to present both of these personas. I'm sure it's similar for you in the security world where like
Right,
your security engineer and application or infra person. There's multiple personas now, and that wasn't the case 5, 10 years ago.
right, exactly. You have to now you have to meet people where they are, and you need to talk to different people. They want different things. Usually, they also don't want to talk to each other so much. Like that's how they define success.
Yep, 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 yep. Very, yeah, you're spot
Awesome.
on.
So, how did you? Well, I guess you told us a bit of your history.
Yeah.
But I was gonna ask like how you got into platform engineering initially, or I guess DevOps, SRE, infrastructure. How did you
Um,
initially
how did I
get
initially
there?
get in this? In high school, probably. We had I went to like a super small high school that was mostly liberal arts focused. Everyone kind of goes to like an Ivy or an East Coast small liberal arts school. And I but ironically, we had a Sun email server, and we had email in like the mid 90s. And for whatever reason, like we would dial up with Z-term effectively and like run Pine that way. And this is like, I mean, we were like high school kids, but like we used it. We used YTalk and Talk to like that was pre-instant messenger, right? And that kind of opened me up to Linux. And I remember installing MK Linux, which is like the version of Linux for the 68K Macs, and trying to figure out how to work this thing. And that led to, okay, maybe I should get a PC. And then that kind of just snowballed into like using Linux in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And then AOL was one of the first to deploy Linux at scale. Actually, one of my good friends was actually the one that brought it into AOL at scale. And
Cool.
kind of went through that journey. And that kind of like, it was never, and what I found along the way is that I really like empowering and creating leverage for teams. And it was always
Hmm.
like one more kind of step in the road of like creating more leverage for teams. And I really enjoyed that. And, it kind of
Right.
culminated at Dropbox, where I ended up having the infrastructure teams, which is everything from supply chain. It's like reliability plus COGS plus DevX. You have to make all of that work all at once. And that to me is platform.
That's
And that was a
cool.
lot of fun. And so we said, like, how do we get more of those components into people's hands at large?
I can definitely resonate with that, right? Because there's only so much you can do as an IC, but in a platform type role, you can do like you have an outsized influence as an IC, which is like,
Yep.
if you're nerding out enough, it's the best of both worlds.
Oh, it's amazing. I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite roles to have, is managing platform teams at scale.
So like, when's the first time you actually ended up using Kubernetes,
So
if you can
I mean,
remember?
I wasn't a Googler, right? So like I had, I mean, first time I probably used a system like it was Borg, right, which is the internal Google system of
Mm,
this. And so I
yeah.
actually did the YouTube. I was part of the team that did YouTube migration from YouTube's infrastructure into Borg, and so saw which you probably have some Googlers that listen to this. I mean, if you've used Google systems or you use Kubernetes, you don't really get into the guts of how it works. But we were moving something that's very incompatible, like from a design pattern onto Google systems. And so that was the first time I saw a system like that and like the power behind it. Um,
Hmm.
we rolled it out at Dropbox with much debate, actually. We had two competing projects, one on Mesos, one on Kubernetes, and then actually three competing products. One on Mesos, very lightweight Kubernetes, and then some homegrown stuff ourselves. Because as a storage
Hmm.
stack, storage and databases, there wasn't a huge motivation on the compute side. And so we were like, we don't run at the time we didn't do any bin packing. We were memory bound, actually, so it didn't really matter if we ran Kubernetes. We wanted to maximize memory for per process on every box because it's Linux, or sorry, because it's a Python app.
Mm.
And so really those are limiting
Oh,
factors,
yeah.
not CPU. So we had one monolith that just we maximized all resources and size to that. Eventually, right, like we started doing Kubernetes more so because we knew we were investing a lot in infrastructure. Like when I say we were investing in infrastructure, we would have ended up building Kubernetes. And we saw that as like that's not a smart move. Like this is not core competency. We
Good.
can do it, but we're not going to build it. I mean, this is the team that built a storage stack from like main at exabyte scale. So they were like, we can build this. This is like whatever. Like this is just another
I
system.
mean, yeah, I can see
Yeah,
how you can get there with
you can
in
get
a
there pretty
company
quick.
like
Yes,
Dropbox.
yes. I mean, we built a monitoring system from scratch. We built a storage system. We built a CI system. We built built Grouper, which I'm sure we'll talk about, from scratch. So
Yeah.
we built all of these things from scratch. So Kubernetes wasn't like, oh, we shouldn't do this. It was like, and then we had a moment where like, okay, we shouldn't do this. And then it kind of snowballed from there. My co-founder actually was a big part of it. It was part of breaking apart the monolith, and it gave a very good application platform. So they built an interface on top of it to manage the monolith and break apart a 4 million line Python app into little servlets that end up being little pods on it. So that was the motivator. It was less about moving to Kubernetes, more about how do we break the monolith apart, and this gave us a way to bin pack without us having to build it.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And
Yes.
my first touch with Kubernetes was also after first trying out Mesos.
Okay.
So yeah,
We
there's
did
so
a
many stuff I wanted to ask you about, but with the time limit, like you dropped a bunch of bits in there. But anyway,
my
with a
my co-founder
segue.
is the one to ask those. He worked on the he and the people building our conversions engine at Prodvana actually are the ones that worked on the Mesos engine. They can tell you all. He worked on both. He is the expert on that side.
Wow, yeah, awesome. So that's a great segue to Dropbox.
Mhm,
And you're joining us today to talk about Grouper at Dropbox, which facilitated access controls for workloads.
mhm.
And we got into, I alluded to this earlier, we got into talking about Grouper and Courier by chance at the recent KubeCon in Chicago.
Yep.
So before we get into it, can you tell us a bit about what's Grouper and Courier?
Okay. So
Asking you to dig
I
deep.
can I'll give you a quick. Grouper's access control system manages all provisioning. I think they've moved off of it at this point, but like for a long time, probably the better part of 10 years. It's probably actually still there in some way, but for 10 years, it was the core access control system for getting production access, whether it's a service
Hmm.
account that needs to talk to another service, or whether it's allocating IAM permission, or it's just a user account in production. Everything was provisioned through Grouper, and then Grouper had a syncing mechanism to actually push us all to the edge. And Courier is the Dropbox's gRPC implementation is the wrong framing. It's
Yeah.
they've taken gRPC and made it into their server stack framework. So everything is a courier
Mhm.
service in the same way that Google talks about Stubby. This is very similar to how that works. You use the courier system as a framework to start a server, and so that gives you everything from authentication to monitoring to basic hooks to talk to like everything else in the system, load balancing. All of that's just built into Courier, but it's fundamentally built on top of the gRPC frameworks.
I see.
Yeah.
Awesome. There's to the listeners and viewers, I'll also say there's a cool blog post by Dropbox
Yep.
on moving to Courier, which has a lot more details on that, if you're curious. So can you tell us what was the motivation for building Grouper? Why
Yep.
why get
Um,
into the journey?
we're gonna go. I'm thinking this. So we built this 2013 or 14, I think, is probably when it was the origins of this. I was actually looking at the other day. A good friend of mine, Gary, was actually the original author of this program. Worked with him both at YouTube and at Dropbox. He and I were very early SREs at Dropbox, and
Mhm.
we knew that we had to worry about permissioning and things like that. And we were going after SOC 2. By the way, this is before SOC 2 had things like Drata and Vanta, which are amazing products to make a lot of this easier. We were like, we have to track all of this somehow. And we were
Mhm.
originally tracking production access control via a spreadsheet, and we had an engineer,
Oh
and her
no.
job was to provision the users. She was coming out of the support team, and we were helping train her up and get her access to production and teach her about how production systems work. And so part of the job was like she would provision the accounts every couple of days. I mean, we're not talking like a large number of accounts. This is like 3 engineers a week or something, right? So you come, you join,
Mhm.
somebody provisions your account, and we would track it all that way. And that turned into a Google form that wrote to the spreadsheet, and then that turned into a web app called Flankit, folded spreadsheets, something like that.
Blanket.
Like spreadsheet, and then you fold it. So Flankit, bad play on words. Gary also. So we built Flankit, and that was like kind of our 6 month like band-aid to like building something real. And we ended up saying like, okay, we have to actually fix this. We have to build something that actually manages permissions. It gives the ability to both give permissions, revoke permissions, audit the permissions. And if you, a big motivator was SOC 2. If you remember in SOC 2, like you have these approvals and these quarterly audits. And so all of those workflows are built into Grouper because we wanted to like make it so that no engineer ever had to sit in the room with E&Y to actually
Hmm.
talk through what happened. So, and
Very
yes,
familiar.
yes. So that's the motivation. This is like I like to say a lot of these motivators are always about what's this it's about self-preservation. And so it was like, what are we good at? We can build this thing. It'll keep us out of the room talking to the audit team. And that's to be honest, like a huge motivator was get Kelsey's time back and then and then prevent us from
Mhm.
spending hours going through this with the audit committees. That's
Um,
the
so
original
the
motivation.
so the courier blog post also goes into how service accounts are managed, how that's already
So
that uh,
yes.
connect
So
into that.
Grouper originally was just about user accounts.
Hmm.
My we're gonna I did some research on this because I some of this is like buried in the history of like why do we do some of these things. Um,
Yeah.
the motivation between tying these two things was that originally had three RPC systems, maybe four,
Hmm.
and we needed to consolidate that. And so the vectors that things were coming in at were we had this security aspect around user account management and SOC 2. We knew that standing up services is hard, and that was actually the original motivator of Courier. Was that standing up
Hmm.
services is very, very hard. We actually went through and said, like, okay, from a DevX perspective, it's 40, 50 steps to do this. We have to cut this down. Grouper being some set of these steps, right? Because you have to provision the accounts, you have to get all this to work.
Hmm.
And we said, okay, we have to figure out a way to make this faster. We have to actually, so that's probably, let's eliminate these three, four RPC systems. Then we started just saying, like, where do we tie these things together? And what we were trying to do was build a workflow for users to be easily able to stand up a backend system with all the right
Hmm.
permissions, with all the right monitoring, with all of the right logging. Everything would just happen out of the box when you imported Courier effectively. And so
Hmm.
that was the main motivation. And the tying it together became we have to go with that service account support now into Grouper. We have to have it very aware of what the how to model ACLs there. And I don't believe my co-founder was reminding me that not all of the things in Courier are actually modeled in Grouper, just because some of them don't make it's like it's think of it as more coarse grained in Grouper, and then there's a lot of fine tuning you can do
Hmm.
inside of the RPC system itself. If you wanted to say like, okay, I want you to only process one out of every 10 requests or whatever from this service, like that doesn't exist in Grouper. That's Grouper just gives you like very coarse grained permissions of this can talk to this, and this is in its managing certificates,
Yeah.
but handling sort of the traffic level load balancing on the services. I think that answered
All right.
part of the question.
Um, so I understand why users, right, they live outside of the cluster.
Mm-hmm.
But why
Right.
bring services into it in the first place, right? Like,
Ah,
why couldn't you just say, hey, it's in the Kubernetes cluster or whatever, it's in the same infrastructure?
oh,
Why
no
not
Kubernetes
just?
clusters at the time. No Kubernetes clusters, and it's funny. I was talking to somebody at Amazon this past week, and both of us. I was at reInvent this past week, and both of us was a senior person on the compute side, and we both were like, yeah, the holy grail, right, is flat L2 network, right? Like that's what you actually want. That's what a user wants. That's what a user thinks they should have. Full L2 non-blocking network, right? Like that makes your life easy as an
Mhm.
engineer. So that's what you're going for, right? So if that's and we were building, that's actually how Dropbox's infrastructure is built. It's full L2 non-blocking within cluster. Um,
Mhm.
the trick with this, right, is that certain things have proxies, certain things have the ability to put traffic in other places. You need to now figure out a way to protect the services that should not talk to other services. So
Right.
a good example of this is that everything is intent space addressed, right? So we can't really talk to public internet without going through some NAT translation here. And so
Mhm.
the way that works there is at the time there was a proxy server that you would literally set the proxy to, right? So now if I don't have the right ACLs, anybody can proxy out, which meant that anybody running something rogue inside the network theoretically could proxy through that edge through the edge network, right? Back out to the
Mhm.
public internet. And that may not be something you want to allow. There's that. That
Right.
was that was a big motivator. But really it's this, we want to give you an L2 network with some infrastructure on top that then has ACLs, because that's where we have to move the protection. So we remove the network. The network doesn't actually have anything besides edge ACLs then.
Right. So what you want is like the experience for developers that everything is flat, but sometimes, that's not enough. You might have more sensitive services or say stuff that goes
Yep.
out that you don't want to just open access to.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so you can't really just have it all open,
You can't
even though.
because yeah, you don't need I'll give an example of this. I from what we did. This is a Google example actually. We had a Let's see if I can explain this succinctly and quickly. We had a proxy server at YouTube that would just mark everything as yes, accepted. And it was like, any RPC you send it to it, it would just say yes. Don't ask why. Really different problem. But this
As
RPC server
in
would just say yes.
allow.
No. The RPC response was just like 200. Okay, I did what you told me to do. Right.
Oh, just like the yes CLI tool in Bash.
Yeah, effectively that, right? So if I sent you an RPC, it could be anything. It could be like delete all data from the web search cache. It would just reply, yes, I've done that. Um, and so, okay, now you can see where this is going.
Sounds like a testing tool. Like nothing will ever fail if you send
Nothing
it.
will ever fail, effectively, right? And so we were running this, and yeah, actual, let's call it tablet server for a storage system started sending requests to it, and we
Mhm.
would just respond, yes, never store the data, right? We just go away, just go
You
to
can
a black
forget
hole.
about your data. I've stored it.
I've
You're
stored
safe
it.
to continue.
Good. Yes, exactly. Right. So great example of where you would probably want an ACL on this, where only the YouTube team should probably have ever had access to this thing because, or whatever testing system on this L2 network, that was the only thing that should ever have talked to this thing. But you really can't provision networks every 30 seconds to like make that connection happen. So this is where the ACL comes in, where we want to have an ACL on this
Mhm.
system that only allows the YouTube testing systems to talk to it. This is a true story. We actually had this. This is probably 2009, 2010. That's actually had this happen. So lessons learned. So that's one
Yeah.
motivator at Dropbox was like, we don't want to see that type of system happen.
Awesome. So you mentioned about how Grouper was configured by developers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both for it was used to onboard and offboard developers, but also
Yes.
to create service accounts. So how did that workflow look like at the latest version you remember?
Latest version, I remember service accounts and user accounts provision exactly the same, just a selector difference. You just say I want a service
Mhm.
account or I want a user account. I believe service account would provisions like mutual TLS certificates for it and handle that workflow on the back end, where user account is just SSH key for us at the time.
Mhm.
I think it's different now given how they set up access control, but back then this is like, you have to remember, this is like pre-Okta having a lot of systems that handle a lot of this stuff at the time. IAM like didn't really exist in any sort of meaningful way. And
Yeah.
so we were really hacking a lot of this together. SSH was still the standard. And so we'd provision SSH key there. And that's actually how that was the interface we gave people. I forgot one of the motivators. For those that don't remember SSH keys, one of the biggest problems any startup ever has is that somebody always loses their key, and then you have to go redistribute this to every machine, and we got tired of handling 50, 60, 100 developers. One a day would be like, oh, I deleted my laptop, I need a new key pushed out, right? And like,
One a day,
yeah,
every day.
engineer, right? Like they delete the directory, right? It's like they're not like it was in their development environment, and they tore down the VM for the development environment because it's like
Oh,
VMware, and like then they stand it up and they don't have it anymore. And so that's the other motivator, is we needed an interface that automatically distributed SSH keys, which now today is also service account keys and all of the rest of the stuff that has to happen under the hood. And so we wanted one interface that was auditable to handle that distribution of keys. That was I forgot about this motivator. That was a very, very large motivator actually. Yeah, that's the behind the scenes of it. Service account versus user account, though, not a lot of difference. um, i believe I believe at one point it was hooked up this way. I mean, Workday would even provision the user account when you got onboarded as an engineer. If you changed your, at one point we had it so that if you changed your role in
mhm.
Workday, like you get flagged inside of Grouper, like should this user still have access to any of this stuff, that kind of stuff. So it's like total provisioning through the system, SOC 2, rest of compliance, all that stuff.
So you use the same system for users and service accounts, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because sometimes developers would call the same APIs that services would
Yes.
call, right? And you'd
Yes.
wanna be able
Yes.
to authenticate.
Yep, exactly. That is the main. That's the other use case, is that every time we stand up a service, the service needs to know who can talk to it. So it was a user account, service account. We also wanted to manage At a high level, what service accounts could talk to what service accounts. And remember, pre-Kubernetes, service account means there's actually a Linux user ID associated with a service account too,
Mm,
right? So we have to provision an actual user for this to run as. It's not as simple as like it is in Kube and like where that's all sort of abstracted and you just like,
right.
yeah. Um,
That's real platform engineering.
yes,
Whenever
yes,
you made a decision like that, you had to like really work for it.
yes.
You weren't
It was
living in a world of
I mean,
declarative
and
goodness.
I mean, it's so many people, right? Like we just run everything under one account everywhere, right? Like at YouTube, when I joined, we had the YouTube Linux account, right? Where every single Linux user would just, every single YouTube app just ran as YouTube. And then, Dropbox, we didn't want that. So we said like, okay, how do we provision account by service? And that eventually leads to like, okay, we have that same abstraction. We can then create the user instead of Kube. We could do the Kube abstraction on that. We could handle IAM permissions on that, but it gave us single place to handle different backends that we had to manage. And so permissions
Mhm.
had like prefixes where you would know which permission this is going to tie to, right? Is it an IAM permission inside of Amazon? Is this going to be an SSH key? You can sort of specify that and know what like makes it flexible for security then, right? To build new pluggable
Mhm.
PAM, right? Like yes. Yes. You can see
Old
someone using
words.
I
It's
mean,
words we don't have to say anymore in the era of cloud native. Now you just specify YAML. You don't have to think about like PAM
I know
plugins and
I'm dating myself on
SSH
terms
keys.
of, I mean, so many of these concepts, right, are like they existed on single node instances, and then we just said like, how do we make these multi-node like distributed system type system? So Grouper under the hood is, I wouldn't say it's much different probably than PAM in terms of like how the interfaces look. I could be wrong,
Yeah.
but like that's we thought about it as like we need to make this pluggable for like any type of backend where we're going to see.
Yeah. That really comes out in the code base. I was actually surprised to find out that Grouper is open source. Well, it's a bit hidden
Yeah,
since the repository is renamed.
yeah.
Do you remember the name?
Neuro and NERU, I think. I actually, I mean, I know I stopped. We moved Grouper out of infrastructure in probably 2017, 2016, and into the security teams, and they started maintaining it. And that's kind of when the first 4 years were kind of
Mhm.
the other side of the world. And you can see sort of a lot of this was motivated more towards how do we automate things, and then security
Yeah.
started shifting it to more to, okay, we have this great foundation that manages these things. How do we create workflows that are super secure on top of it? And so their
Yeah.
motivations became way more around the ackling, where our motivations were way more around the automation. But I think it's a great example of where a security tool and infrastructure can play very nicely together. As like it's
Yeah.
like the two persona thing we talked about. Like you can incubate it in one of the two teams, but you have if you get it right, it creates so much leverage between organizations. I think if we had pure security tool or pure infra tool, like we just built something like both teams would have ended up building totally different, like would have had two different things trying to compete for the same type of workload, and it would have been a nightmare. So I'm actually pretty happy that kind of it did
Yeah.
incubate both sides.
When you're able to build one tool that two sides are able to leverage for different purposes, that's when you can get, we talked about the experience for the engineer that everything is a layer 2 network.
Yep.
You can get that, but
Yep.
only if you can get close enough with the abstraction for both sides. That they
Yep.
can each say, engineers want to say that I just want to connect to this thing, right? I want to like resolve DNS and send packets and have it work. I don't even want to think about packets, right? I just want
Yep.
to type in the service
Sure, sure,
name. And security teams want to know that everything is intentional, and they will make your life a nightmare. But they're also very cognizant of that
yep.
engineering organizations need to move quickly, and that they're the most expensive part of the organization.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes. Yes.
it's a bit of a conflict, but good tools can fix that.
Yep.
So I think that really brings us over. I mentioned earlier the quote that was on your booth, and I think is actually on your website from one of your
Mm-hmm.
users, who said that the future of deployment is intent based.
Mm-hmm.
And at Otherwise, we also think in terms of intents. That experience of the user saying, "This is what I want to happen."
Yep.
I don't want to do all this low level stuff. Just make it happen. Make my service run. Make it the connectivity work. Make the SOC 2
Yep.
auditors happy.
Yep.
Just let
Yep.
me get a move on. So Grouper was a system for managing permissions that is it's a bit imperative, right? Like you had to tell it, create a
Yeah.
user, give this permission, and so on.
Yeah.
So would you do it differently today with that philosophy of taking it one level higher of the abstraction, declaring the desired results rather than specifying the list of permissions and accesses you want?
The answer is
A big
yes.
question.
I mean, it's a leading. I mean, I don't think it's a leading. I mean, I think the answer is yes. Um, I think that it. I haven't given that space enough thought about how would you do it, but the answer is like yes. No, like seeing the workflows that people are building today, like it, and having dealt with IAM permissions myself, I don't want to think about them in the same way that the cloud providers want you to think about them. Like it's just too many, it's too complicated. And I also don't think that Terraform and Pulumi do a great job at like making it any better. It just gives you a place to put it. It doesn't give you a place to actually like
Mhm.
encode intent. So I think that must be a way better way of managing it. Yes.
I think that like Google and Apple are doing a better job of thinking about permissions than cloud and cloud native.
Hmm.
With apps where you say, I want to access the microphone, I need access to
Yes.
fine-grained location,
Yep.
and it's high level enough that
Hmm.
like real people, normal people, my mom
Yep.
is able to understand the prompt
Yep.
and say accept or deny, and then the developer knows it's actually gonna work.
Yep.
With IAM, say on Amazon, it can be so complicated that you have no idea if it's gonna work until you actually run the thing in
Hmm.
production.
Yep.
Which like it doesn't have to be that way. Phone apps, they don't work that way. You have the intent, the permission,
Hmm.
then it's gonna work.
I had not thought of it that way, but that makes total sense. Because it's interesting. I find that I've made this shift myself mentally on on like sort of the deployment and like the SRE and like that side of the world where start from the user and go backwards. It's interesting when you articulate it that way. I think that you've definitely made that flip on the security side, right? Where you're like, okay, let me start from the user and go this direction. Which I think once you do that, like it removes all the constraints that people had previously, right? It doesn't change that you have to add the IAM permissions, but it changes the experience that the user gets, which I think is like the most important part of this whole problem these days. Experiences are just awful.
Yep, yep. It's like, but I think it's that it's not that somebody set out to build an awful experience, even though it
Yep.
sometimes feels like Amazon is kind of doing it intentionally. But I mean, I mean, no harm. um, but it's just a result of the complexity. I think the reason that Android and iOS have done better, like for the first even though they've existed for less time than cloud, is just because there's less complexity.
Yep.
Just there's so much for anyone to think about that even like it tends to become a sprawl rather than compress.
Yep.
And it takes generations of products to yield something like Prodvana. It
Yep.
actually takes it another level higher.
I think the other, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think the other problem, right, is that the end user is so different for like an iPhone or Android, and the level of product thinking is just light years ahead when you have to consider, your mom using this permission model as opposed to like, oh, the security engineer that's used to this is like, there must be only one way to do it. Well, no, there might be another way. I think the cultural shift that's happening in platforms is probably one of the hardest pieces of it, right? Is like we're seeing a changing of the guard, but I think it needs to accelerate in a lot of ways.
Yep, definitely. Here's hoping for simpler systems. Future of
Simple.
deployment is intent based.
Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on the end.
Mhm.
Well done for making it this far.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you gave me one hot take earlier about, hey, maybe don't use Kubernetes. I'm all for that if you can keep it simple.
Yeah.
Um, is there one more that you can give me that's in the area of, so if you're on Kubernetes
Hmm.
and you need to deploy something complicated, what would you, I don't know,
I
something that,
This is not really a
yeah.
hot take, but well, maybe it is for some folks, but I think that my personal hot take is that pipeline driven development or pipeline sort of driven like systems, they make zero sense in cloud native worlds at this point. You need some basic sort of building blocks of like, okay, but if you go to a much more intent-based declarative system, you avoid so much of the complexity by removing the pipeline and letting the system figure it out. I think that's one. And then
Right.
I think that, and I think this is a hot take in the platform world, at least from what I can tell, is that I this is my true hot take. Because I had I was getting a lot of feedback on this one. I think that the world of platform engineering has no idea what's going to happen with ML and AI and how much more complicated and how much
Hmm.
more is going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months than they expect. So the way I look at this is Copilot is $100 million ARR business already, and you have companies out there, very, very large companies, $40+ billion valuations, that are mandating Copilot across engineering. And they're saying they're seeing 10x increase in their principal engineers that don't have to write boilerplate code and can spend it doing architectural reviews. Okay, that removes major bottlenecks. So now we should either see a lot
Yes.
more product, a lot more services, a lot more something. Yes. And so
Yes,
if
there's gonna
yeah,
be a lot more.
so platform teams have
The
to realize and they have to get on board with this, and they can't say that it's not going to happen and that AI is a venture capital like
No, it's
yeah,
real. It's
it's
real.
real.
Like
It's real in a way
I've
that like it is as real as mobile was. It is as real as like all of these other major inflections have happened. And I think that there's a lot of portion of the platform community that doesn't think it's real and thinks it's just like
hmm.
fake. Like it's just statistics, right? It's like
It's gonna go away.
yeah,
It's a word generator,
yeah,
right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
The other day I saw a web app where you could draw squares and write
Hmm.
text explaining what those squares did, and then there was a button, make it real,
Yeah,
and it creates a JavaScript app.
yeah,
And there
yeah,
was one person who made like squares of Pong and a little paddle and wrote, "These disappear, the ball moves,"
yeah.
and
It's
it wrote Pong.
yeah. It's gonna
That
it's there. I mean, I think it is real, and I think that the way we manage systems will change. And we will have to bring more AI tools into the world of platforms that are managing platforms. They just have to be as good as a human, like which they, as a college grad,
Mhm.
like, and you just ask them to explain it, just like you would ask anyone else. I think there's a lot of I think that's the one hot take I'd have is like platform engineering just needs to like really understand this is real. Like then they can't keep thinking about it as um we'll
needs
see.
to scale up.
Yeah.
It needs to be, what if you could combine intent based
Yeah.
with AI? Like,
Yeah.
what if you can use natural language to
Oh,
say,
it's
do
so
all this stuff?
the world it's there's so many possibilities that are going to open up with it, and I think that's the part that I think they just that I would, if I could leave one thing with platform engineers, like realize it's real and start thinking about the implications for it. Like even if you don't have a plan yet, just accept that it's going to happen, and it's going to happen faster than Web 2 did. It's going to happen faster than
Yeah.
mobile did. It's probably 18 months. It's not 5 years. That's
It's
the thing. Yeah.
the nature of the change, right? Because AI is like, it's multiplicative.
It's
As
multiplicative.
it gets more real, it speeds up.
Yeah, yep.
I hope not to a bad place, but to a good place
And
where we intend to have software written and it happens,
but it's gonna
and
happen.
not
I
like Skynet.
no, yeah, I know, no Skynet, but it's gonna happen. I think that's my hot take. I don't know if it's controversial for some, not controversial for others, but like it's like I know I've talked to a
Makes
lot of
perfect
platform
sense.
people that just don't believe in it, which I worry
Wow,
about. Yes.
really? Actually, that's super interesting. I haven't had a chance to hear that. It's You've now motivated me to talk to
You
ask
should
more people about that. I'm curious to see what people think firsthand. So, what's next for you?
next for us,
Um,
next for me. Continue
for
building
you,
Prodvana.
for Prodvana, just
For Prodvana, continue building on Prodvana. We have been
yep.
super lucky to have some good early customers and get some good early traction. And so continue building on that momentum. We're at this point we've deployed at very large scale, and so now we're sort of want to see continue to grow the user base on it. And I have some interesting features in the AI space actually that we're looking at for next year, as well as I think the other big one that we've been seeing a lot of interest around is like the persona based development is just been game changing for us, where we can give you an info persona, an app persona, show you how your commits flowing through as a commit if you're an application engineer, show you a Docker image if you're an infrastructure engineer. And like those two, flipping between those two views, people seem to just really resonates with them. So continuing to double down on that, because I think that there's a changing of the guard in platforms and how people think about building this stuff.
For sure, yeah. Prodvana is really awesome. I can say I'm one of your users as well.
Thank you.
What drew me in was the clairvoyance feature, which looks at your commits and tells you like which were the high impact commits in every deploy. Check them out. So one final question: how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Prodvana.io or Andrew@Prodvana.io or LinkedIn. I'm not a Twitter user or an X user. I primarily LinkedIn or email is really good.
Awesome. So
Awesome.
thank you so much, Andrew,
Thank you.
for joining me, and thanks for all the DevOps.
Thank you. Thank you, Ori.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.